The rumble of wagons rolling somewhere far away on the track startled the flagman and the station master of the water stop, making them jump to their feet. They both dropped the cards without as much as a word. The flagman rushed out of his booth and, grabbing the crank, began lowering the barrier. He cast a glance into the darkness. The train was not yet visible, but it was approaching. He could hear it clearly. The station master followed him outside. "What the devil is this supposed to mean?" he shouted. There was no signal. And the buzzer is silent. The men heard the increasing thud, but still couldn't see the train. Was the locomotive running without lights? Nonsense. The railwayman checked his watch. It was almost midnight. The freight train wasn't due until 2 o'clock. Something must have jammed, the station master said. "I remember back in '48. He didn't finish, freezing with his mouth open." The sound of the approaching train suddenly ceased, but at the same time, they both saw it. The train emerged from the darkness, casting an otherworldly glow. It was rushing straight toward them, now in complete silence. The acetylene headlights of the locomotive blazed with a bright blue light. Additional electric lamps were hung on the steam drum and chimney. In front of the buffers, they spotted a large portrait adorned with a black ribbon. The locomotive emitted a cloud of steam, but no sound came from the whistle. The train was clearly accelerating. The brightly lit wagons passing by the booth blurred into a single streak. Somewhere among them, a platform briefly flashed by, carrying a flatbed with a glass-covered, empty coffin. As the rear buffer crossed the passage, the light suddenly extinguished, and only the distant sound of the receding train's wheels could be heard, carried by the wind. The station master slowly raised a hand trembling with fear and crossed himself. "God Almighty," he whispered. "So it's true." Petrowski woke up with a scream. Trembling, he fumbled under the bed for a bottle of vodka and took a long swig. The alcohol dulled his senses, allowing him to control the nervous trembling. He had the same dream again. The old prisoner in striped prison clothes rises from his bunk and starts breaking the cell bars with his bare hands. UB officer watches this and can't comprehend why it fills him with animal terror. He had seen this man a few years ago during special training in Warsaw. They were visiting the 10th Pavilion of the Mokoto prison, a place where particularly fierce enemies of the new order were held. The warden showing them around was displaying, as if on a zoo tour, the most interesting supporters of capitalism and imperialism, pre-war officers, members of Sanation regime, bandits of the forests and paratroopers dropped by the Americans. In one of the barred cells, sitting on a bunk, was the enemy number 1. Wacław Kastek-Banacki, before the war the unofficial governor of several southeastern provinces of Poland. The right-hand man of Marshal Pilsudski, a man who had tracked down dozens of Communist Party agents and, in his free time, tortured communists imprisoned in Bereza Kartuska. Widely regarded by the left as the devil-made flesh. Petrowski observed this old man, worn out by age and years of torture, through the bars and the mesh. Suddenly, the prisoner raised his head. His eyes gleamed like a wolf's eyes. Upon seeing the young secret police officers, he twisted his face into a predatory smile. "The tables will turn soon," he growled. "And before you bite the dust, a meeting with me awaits you." He laughed harshly, an absurd threat thrown by a man standing at death's door. Yet for the following months, whenever Petrowski recalled this event, he felt beads of sweat running down his back. And then there were those damn dreams. Thankfully, tonight he was staying in his own quarters and not in the barracks. If the leadership found out that he was screaming in his sleep. The old man sat behind the office railing, on the side reserved for supplicants. On his lap, he held a worn-out, as old as time itself, suitcase made of cardboard covered in oilcloth. "Director Karwitz should be here soon," said the secretary, lazily shuffling papers. He thanked her with a nod. He observed the girl out of the corner of his eye. The blonde curls framing her pretty, though ordinary face, made her resemble a sheep content with life. Her red tie hung limply, stained with a spot of scrambled eggs from the breakfast. Friendly, pleasant, not too bright, dedicated to building the system. The authorities like people like her. The door creaked open, and Karwitz entered the waiting room. He moved with the grace of a hippopotamus. His suit was certainly the work of a good tailor, but since the time it had been made, the dignitary had gained a lot of weight. His bloated face with bloodshot eyes gave off a repulsive impression. To me? He glanced darkly at the supplicant. Come in. He opened the office door. The old man closed his eyes for a second, so their expression wouldn't betray the depth of his disappointment, then stood up and moved in the indicated direction. He had hoped for a slightly different turn of events, but he wasn't about to give up without a fight. The office was bright and spacious, filled with solid pre-war office furniture. A portrait of Berat looked down from the wall, and there was also a large plaster bust of Stalin. Lenin's portrait hung above the door. A wide panoramic window overlooked the station, clearly suggesting that the all-powerful official wanted to give the impression that he personally supervised the institution entrusted to him. Before the war, people used to say, "The master's eye fattens the horse," flashed through the old man's mind. "What can I do for you?" Karwich sat behind the desk, magnanimously gesturing for the visitor to take a seat. "I'm looking for work on the railway," the old man said with dignity, taking the offered seat. "At your age, you qualify for retirement." The director looked at him sternly. "Let me guess, the people department sent you to hell, and that's why you came to me?" "Yes." This surprised Karwich. The old man didn't try to evade or scheme, and even though he had been seen through, he didn't lose his composure. There was something enigmatic about him. In fact, that figure seemed strangely familiar. Had they met before? "Why come to me? I'm in charge of infrastructure, not employment. The Personnel Resources Department is on the second floor, you should have gone there." "There I don't know anyone." "You don't know?" Karwich looked at him intently, and suddenly, a flash of recognition appeared in his eyes. It must have been still before the war. His father worked as a conductor back then. A few times, a locomotive driver friend had stayed over at their house. "Uncle Igor?" He finally recognized his visitor and was astonished. "You're still alive?" "For now, yes." "Well, such a meeting deserves to be celebrated." He pulled out a bottle of Armenian cognac from the drawer and generously poured 2 glasses. He downed his in one gulp. His features softened a bit. "Tell me, how do you do?" he said. "I haven't seen you since, what, 39? Dad thought you had died. He searched for you after the war, and last year we buried him." "Where have you been all these years?" "I was in the Soviet Union. Worked a bit in forestry, then a bit in the mines. Then, let's say, my contract ended, and I started efforts to return to the homeland. I arrived less than a month ago." Karwich frowned again. The old man seemed to like using deep language. He wasn't amused by such word games, although he had to admit that Uncle Igor dropped his hints very skillfully. "So you did your time, and they let you go," he muttered. "An hour's, what?" "They didn't give a pension to a reactionist. They gave me 150, considering my pre-war years of service. My work record from the Soviets didn't exactly evoke friendly feelings. And what am I supposed to do with you now?" the director pondered. "Do you even have the strength to work?" "I can manage." Karwich gave Uncle Igor a scrutinizing look. Igor didn't look bad. His posture was straight, his gaze still sharp without signs of senility. Hard muscles were visible under his jacket. Fit for work, but soon enough, he'd burn out like a candle. Can he refuse to help him? No, what was he thinking? He remembered his childhood. After all, it was Uncle Igor who once gave him a toy fire truck for his birthday. Anyone else he would have sent packing immediately, but one needs to help his own. "How old are you?" 70? He quickly did the math. 76. The director was troubled. He had to admit that Uncle Igor was holding up exceptionally well. By first glance you wouldn't give him more than 60. On the other hand, a man who survived the gulags wasn't easily broken. "Quite a bit. We need something light." He approached the door, opened it slightly, and looked for the secretary. "Polar, the file, the one with the yellow cover," he ordered. After a moment, he was flipping through the papers. "I may have something for you," he finally said. Of course, you can no longer be a locomotive engineer, but we need someone to operate the pump at the water stop between Kielce and Radom. He cast a probing look at the old man's face. That suits me. 400 a month, plus you'll have a room at the station. You'll also get work clothes and a railroad uniform. He looked at Uncle Igor's worn-out jacket. But don't tell anyone I got you this job. And don't let the inspectors see you. You'll start the day after tomorrow. The secretary will run to personnel now, and we'll get you assigned and other paperwork. Thank you. Oh, it's nothing, Uncle. If you have any trouble, come to me right away. Now, just the travel document. Can you leave right away? I have everything with me. In that case, you should take the freight train. It leaves in 2 hours. You'll travel comfortably to your post. Now, let's have one for the journey. He poured another round. Such an occasion doesn't happen every day. Report, comrade. The general stood with his hands clasped behind his back, staring out the window. He was clearly in a very bad mood. Major Petrowski stood at attention like a string-pulled taut. The train was observed at 20 locations between Kielce and Radom, he reported. We interrogated 48 witnesses, including 6 of our collaborators. Cooperators, the general growled. Collaborators and spies are what imperialists have. Yes, General. The testimonies roughly coincide. At the front of the train is a steam locomotive, followed by probably 8 to 10 wagons, including a platform carrying a hearse with a coffin. A coffin? That's what it looks like. The box is likely made of iron straps, of typical shape, and glass covered. Empty. At the front of the locomotive is a large portrait of Pilsudski, above it a pre-war eagle with a crown. The portrait is draped in black ribbon and illuminated. Comparative analysis indicates that the train is identical to the one that transported Pilsudski's corpse from the funeral ceremonies in Warsaw to Krakow in 1934. So far, the appearance of such a train has been recorded several times in different parts of the country, and even, Petrowski lowered his voice, apparently beyond its borders. And what do you make of it? The general looked at his subordinate calmly but inquisitively. There is basically only one possibility. Some fascist organization is operating on the railroad, trying to sow unrest in society. I don't believe in ghosts anyway. That's very good, Comrade Petrowski. The general smiled predatorily. Your task will be simple. You are to eliminate this problem. By any means necessary. Yes, Comrade General. But how? The major's eyes widened. It appears here and there, tracking it down will be terribly difficult. Of course, I will make every effort to complete this task, but... You see, this problem has been worked on for quite some time. There's a certain pattern in the train's movement, the general said, patting a few report folders lying on his desk. First of all, it's impossible to predict where it will appear, but once it is spotted it always returns to the same route twice. After how long? It varies. Usually, the events are separated by several to a dozen or so days. This means that the conspirators' actions have a certain repetitiveness, which we can turn to our advantage. Yes, General. The steam locomotive needs not just coal. This is basically the only place in the area where those bastards can get water. The general tapped a map with his finger. Not necessarily. Petrowski pointed to a few streams near the tracks with his pencil. They could stop, for example, here, on the bridge, and draw water with a bucket if needed. Don't joke, comrade, it would take all night to fill the tank that way. Besides, who has the strength to work that hard? So how much do they need? The Sekop asked in surprise. More than a barrel? From what I've gathered, 15 cubic meters per 100 kilometers of track. So, roughly speaking, 1,000 buckets. Let's not rule out your hypothesis right away. The general circled a spot on the map. They'd need to carry a solid fire engine pump with them, but who knows? For now, we need to keep an eye on these people. He tapped a building on the map. Also, think about setting up an ambush. Yes, General. The train was last seen on this line. It appeared here and here. He marked the spots on the strategic map with his pen. The first observation in the latest series was made at this point. We're waiting for further incidents. What's located here, exactly? It's a reserve fuel depot for diesel locomotives, and right next to it is an auxiliary farm and a large strategic reserve warehouse of our institution. So it was seen over a distance of about 40 kilometers. And the water station was sort of at the end of its route. Yes. Do you see the possibilities this gives you? If the train appears again and passes our observer hidden near the tracks 40 kilometers from the water supply point, I'll have time to prepare an ambush. Or rather, to spring one that's already prepared. Pietrowski corrected himself. The general's presence was overwhelming him, making it difficult to gather his thoughts, let alone articulate them. Plenty of time. Depending on how fast it moves, anywhere from 50 to 80 minutes. Should I try to stop it at the water station? In the event of a derailment or a fight with the train crew, the infrastructure could be damaged, and besides, witnesses are rather unnecessary. The major answered his own question. Perhaps it's better here? He pointed to an unguarded crossing 300 meters away. Good idea, the general assessed. You'll stay at the water stop. There are certainly staff rooms there and a telephone line independent of the railway network. We'll station our people at the militia precinct. If anything happens, one call will get you reinforcements within 20 minutes. Take a motorcycle, there's a pathway from the station to the crossing, and you'll be able to quickly reach the ambush site. I'll leave the technical details to you. Yes, Comrade General. If you handle this efficiently, there will be a bonus, and a promotion isn't out of the question either. The coach slowed down and finally came to a screeching halt. It's here. The engineer pointed to the buildings. Thank you very much for the ride. Uncle Igor lifted his luggage and shuffled down the iron steps. I haven't had the chance to ride in a locomotive for over a dozen years. I almost forgot what a pleasure it is. With some difficulty, he jumped onto the gravel-covered embankment. He wobbled, but quickly regained his balance. The arm of the pump turned with a creak, and water began to flow into the locomotive's boiler. The old man looked around. The water stop was small, a primitive water tower, a steel truss with a rusty tank on top, likely dated back to the time of the Tsar. Nearby stood a small wooden shed for locomotives and a house with a slightly sagging roof. A few dozen meters away, by the crossing, stood a whitewashed flagman's booth. There was also a switch and a rusted track curving to the east. Warm gusts of autumn wind lazily tugged at the laundry hanging on a line. At the sight of the unexpected visitor, the station master emerged from the station building. Welcome. He shook Igor's hand. They called this morning to announce you. My name is Marek. Igor. The supervisor is on vacation, he won't be back for 2 weeks. I'll show you around our little establishment, he offered. You'll see what's what. Thank you. Agata, he called out. A teenage girl in a cretonne dress emerged from the house. This is Mr. Igor, our new employee, he explained. Take his luggage and sweep the room where the lamps used to be. Clean the windows, put in fresh bedding and a new curtain. Line the shelves in the wardrobe and drawers with paper. Maybe put some geranium on the windowsill, it'll make the place cozier. Yes, Dad, if I can do anything else for Mr. Thank you for your concern, I don't need anything more. Igor handed her his nearly empty suitcase. The girl quickly disappeared into the building. Please follow me. Marek indicated the direction with his hand. Igor looked around. A double track, above it a pump with a movable hydrant arm operated by a crank and gear system. The flagman, temporarily assigned to this task, had just finished filling the water. The freight train Igor had arrived on was already moving on. The cars clattered over the rail joints. This will be your job. When the locomotive stops at the red marker, you'll activate the... Thank you, I know the procedure. Did you work on the railroad? I was a locomotive engineer before the war. Although I was the one being supplied with water back then, you understand, Mr. Marek. No need for mister. Please, just Marek. You'll be my superior, I prefer. Of course. The pump draws water from the water tower. And it's supplied by a second pump from underground tanks. The old man deftly changed the subject. Yes. The one on the tower holds 60 cubic meters, the underground ones are larger, 2 at 180 each and a reserve tank at 60. What's the traffic like during the day? Usually up to 20 steam locomotives. So, we could say that if something were to happen, we have a reserve for a maximum of 2 days. In dry years, the supply might not be sufficient. It's happened a few times. If the number of steam locomotives passing through the station suddenly tripled, for example, there might not be enough water for them. If war breaks out, the railway will be transporting soldiers and materials mainly along the east-west lines. The station master bit his tongue too late, but the old man ignored his words. I think it's worth bringing this problem to the attention of the management, he said seriously. We've reported it, but so far, nothing has come of it. Apparently, there are no funds allocated for expanding the water intakes and stations, the station master replied bitterly. Igor scanned the tracks with his eyes. Diesel and electric locomotives will surely gradually take over more and more of the trains. Thus, the role of water stops will diminish, and in 20 or 30 years, they may become completely obsolete, he finally said. Perhaps the management has decided that further expansion of this facility is economically pointless. Is that what you think? It seems that way, though I'm not sure. When I was recently in the USSR, I met an engineer who had traveled to the USA before the war. He told me a few stories. The station master sensed that his new subordinate didn't want to speak directly, but he immediately understood that the mentioned engineer had been in a labor camp, and the railways in America had probably been fully electrified for quite some time. It was better to drop this dangerous topic as quickly as possible. Here's the rail switch. He pointed to the device. But it's never used. Why? That track, he gestured toward the rails curving away, leads to the broad gauge railway connecting Silesia and Tarnobrzeg with the Soviet Union. But how? This track is of standard gauge, Uncle Igor expressed surprise for the first time. Exactly. A mistake in the design. There was supposed to be a small transfer station here, but one of the planners erred, and we're left with that. You know, they ordered it, so we made the connection, but we can't send a train there, for it would lead to a disaster. He smiled wryly. Quite right. And that shed? An auxiliary locomotive shed? Igor nodded toward another switch and a track disappearing into a small building made of darkened pine planks. More or less, Marek confirmed his guess. Minor repairs can be done there. There's a cleaning pit and a set of pipes for boiler washing. If there's a cleaning installation, then the building must have its own water tank? Yes, an underground one, 130 cubic meters. German-made, if I remember correctly. They also used it as a reserve in case of fire, but when they fled, they destroyed the hydrants, so now we can only connect hoses to the main installation. Frankly, there hasn't been an incident so far. You could connect it with an underground pipe to the ones from the pump, and we'd have a reserve that could supply water to 9 additional locomotives per day, Igor said, looking at the concrete cover gleaming in the grass near the shed. The station master looked at the old man with a mix of respect and amazement. He had arrived only minutes ago and had already not only identified a weak point in the system, but also figured out how to fix it. I never thought of that, he whispered. But it's so obvious. We need to get 40 to 50 meters of large diameter pipe from the material base, and the problem is solved. And send a few workers for a few days to dig the proper trench, because tunneling isn't cost effective. They entered the shed. What is that? The former engineer was astonished, seeing an ancient locomotive at the end of the track. That's a Russian steam locomotive. Or maybe I should say, a corpse of a locomotive, waiting for burial in the depths of some furnace. It dates back to the Tsar's time and the construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway. Though maybe something could still be done with it. A few of its contemporaries are still in service on our lines. It's said to be quite a sturdy design. True. So what's happened to this one? We received it as a gift from the Red Army. They abandoned it here right after the war, returning from their campaign to Berlin. A few mechanics tinkered with it, but it's such an old model that they couldn't manage. There's a bonus for anyone who can get it running well enough to make it to the repair base in Katowice or Radom. Can I give it a try? In my free time, after hours. I used to work on these. I know their quirks. Sure. Feel free to tinker as much as you like. The tools are in the cabinet. Come see me later, and I'll give you the keys. He looked at his watch. In 15 minutes, we've got a passenger train to Krakow. They signaled a problem with the grease. We'll help them, and then I invite you over for tea. After that, it'll be quiet until 2 in the night. So, you came back from there. The station master gazed thoughtfully out the window. For quite a few years now, they haven't been letting anyone go. I convinced some important people to support my pleas. Igor made a gesture with his fingers, mimicking counting money. The flagman and the station master nodded. In recent years, life had often reminded them of the principle, all the wheels, and you'll go. And how is it there? Mr. Marek asked the question against his better judgment. Everything is better and cheaper. Igor shrugged, repeating a propaganda slogan. There might be some, temporary and incidental of course, issues with the distribution of goods. You know, it's a country where yesterday is already tomorrow, he joked. They immediately understood that he didn't want to talk about it and that he wouldn't. Do you have any relatives here in Poland? The station master changed the subject. I used to, but you understand, after 2 occupations, it's hard to keep track. In that seemingly innocent sentence, the old man conveyed everything necessary, even where he had lived before the war broke out. Besides, his melodic borderland accent still occasionally slipped into his speech. Well, let's drink to your return. The station master pulled a bottle of cheap wine from his bag. It's a poor drink, but the better ones have mysteriously disappeared from the stores lately. It seems even here, distribution can't keep up with the decadent expectations of a consumerism demoralized populace, he added with mock seriousness. I won't refuse. I haven't drunk anything this good in years. The conversation flowed smoothly, and even if anyone had been eavesdropping, they wouldn't have raised any suspicions. And yet they immediately understood what he meant. What he drank on the other side of the border was far worse than this cheap plonk. Maybe you should get some rest, Mr. Marek suggested with concern. You must be tired after all this journey. Oh, yes, Igor sighed. But it was nice to see the world from the height of a locomotive again. He finished the wine, bowed politely, and went to his room. A small 2x4-meter space. The iron bed was peeling paint. The striped, grey-blue mattress had been gnawed by mice. Tufts of straw were poking through the holes. A small table with an inset basin served as a washstand. Above it, a cracked, cloudy mirror hung on the wall. The furnishings were completed by a metal cabinet in the corner and a rickety stool. The curtain on the window, like the rug on the floor, had come from some decommissioned train car. A railroad junkyard and a wreck of a man, Uncle Igor sighed to himself. So, you could say, everything is in the right place, he joked grimly. He wandered across the creaking wooden floor. He placed his suitcase on the bed. On the edge of the washstand, he set a box with soap and a brush, next to it a razor, and he hung the strop on a nail sticking out of the wall. He pressed the pedal and watched for a moment as water flowed from a large glass jar above into the faucet. He was settling in. The uniform lay on the chair. The pants were a bit loose, but the jacket was a perfect fit. Uncle Igor put on the cap and then looked in the mirror. Just like the good old days, he muttered. His drowsiness vanished in an instant. He felt the blood start to circulate more vigorously in his veins. His bent spine straightened, and his eyes regained a bit of their former sparkle. He was once again a cog in a great, magnificent machine. He would once again be doing what he was made to do. He took a sewing kit and a piece of cloth from his backpack. The mattress needed some patching. Then he would borrow a rag and a rice brush to clean the floor. And he could manage. He smiled under his mustache. He had made it. He had really made it. He had left a country from which there was no return. He was back in his homeland, working on the railroad again. Millions of people had less luck. Slowly, a cool autumn dusk was setting in. Igor lit the oil lamp and began reading by its light. Most of the regulations hadn't changed over the past 3 decades, but there was some new equipment, and part of the vehicles had also been somewhat modernized. The engine's roar shattered the morning silence. Igor, who was oiling the pump mechanism, looked up from the gears. A heavy post-war German motorcycle with a sidecar drove up the dirt road to the station building. A man in a leather coat got out. Just at the sight of him, the old man felt a strange sinking feeling in his stomach. "What can we do for you?" The station master stepped out in front of the house and gave the visitor a scrutinizing look. He didn't like the man either. A rat-like face adorned with a tuft of red hair had something repulsive about it. The leather outfit suggested he was a militiaman or possibly someone even worse. Major Petrowski, the newcomer, introduced himself. County Security Office in Kielce. His voice carried strange undertones, as if a mix of arrogance and disdain for his interlocutor. "Your subordinates interrogated us all night. I have nothing more to add." The station master shrugged. "Everything has been documented. But if necessary, we'll answer your questions again. I've been ordered to inspect the operation of the main line." The major showed the order. "Your station facilities inventory includes 1 vacant room. There is, Marek confirmed. You can stay there and carry out your inspection. I'll get you the keys." The room was almost empty, a small table, a bed, and a coat hanger on the wall. It used to house the engineers of shunting locomotives. No one had stayed there for 10 years. It could use some sweeping. The Sekop looked at the dusty floor with disdain. Indeed, the station master agreed. "The broom is in the hallway. And now, if you'll excuse me, duty calls." He left, boiling with suppressed anger. Which devil sent us this kind of guest? Igor quickly reminded himself of the procedures. After 3 days, he was already familiar with the rhythm of the work. Steam locomotives would pull into the station, the engineers would open the tanks, and the old man, turning the crank, would move the water spout arm over the openings and activate the water release lever. Since his time working on the railroad, a few new types of locomotives had appeared, but remembering how many cubic meters each one took wasn't a problem for him. His memory, fortunately, was still sharp. 3 times a day, he operated the pre-war motor pump to fill the main tank of the water tower. The work wasn't particularly strenuous, and its repetitive nature brought a sense of peace. It allowed him to rest after the hardships of daily life in the most magnificent, largest, and richest country in the world. After work, he would walk to the nearby town to buy a newspaper. The news was, as usual, carefully selected and censored, but after years of reading Pravda, the local press seemed unexpectedly almost subversive to him. Every morning, the station master's daughter, Agata, brought him hot tea, and in the evenings, he would drop by his superior's place to smoke a pipe and chat. The only problem was the Sekop in the leather coat. He lingered around the station, photographing passing trains, writing down their numbers for reasons unknown, and sometimes, taking advantage of the stops, he would study the freight car manifests. Occasionally, he would take the motorcycle and go somewhere, but mostly, he adorned the platform like a poisonous mushroom. It wasn't until the 3rd day, late in the afternoon, that the old man finally decided to visit the shed. The locomotive really did date back to before World War I. Igor first inspected it from the outside. It didn't look too bad. He walked around the machine, climbed into the cab. The firebox door was covered in a rusty patina, and the hinges were a bit stiff. He dripped some oil on them, waited a moment, and then opened the door. He shone a flashlight inside. After the last trip, no one had bothered to remove the slag. The grate was covered with a thick, baked-on layer of unburned coal residues. The old man tapped it with a poker, breaking it up a bit. 2 days of work and it'll be over, he said to himself, lighting his pipe. So the cause must be something else? He squeezed into the firebox. Shining his flashlight, he examined the fire tubes. They were coated with soot and ash, but they seemed clear. The superheater pipes were almost completely clogged, but cleaning them wouldn't take more than a few hours. He moved along the boiler, opening inspection holes along the way. The braces around the furnace and boiler, although covered with a crust of rust, seemed intact. He tapped a few of them with a wrench. The sound was good. He crossed the walkway to the front and opened the smoke box door. At some point, due to a leak in the pipes, a lot of soot had accumulated there. Everything inside was covered in grime, but Igor didn't notice any major damage. The leak could be soldered. Finally, he stepped back and, lifting the main hatch, looked into the boiler. "So we've hit the nail," he muttered. The inside of the tank was coated with a thick layer of scale. It formed a solid crust on the fire tubes, with stalactite-like formations hanging downward. The pipe leading to the steam dome and regulator was almost completely blocked. "How's the inspection going?" The station master's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. His superior was standing next to the locomotive, watching the old man's work with interest. "They were drawing water from a normal well for several months," Igor explained. "The steam went up, the minerals accumulated. Everything got encrusted with scale. Can it be fixed?" Uncle Igor scratched his head. "Probably, yes," he finally said. "I'll tinker with it after hours, and we'll see." Marek left. Igor wheeled a slag cart out of the storage room, placed it on the auxiliary track, and carefully lowered it down the slope to the cleaning pit. Hunched over, he pushed it under the locomotive until it was right under the firebox. The ashpan latch was rusted, but a few blows loosened it enough to slide it open. The steel drawer dropped with a deafening screech. Grey ash cascaded into the waiting cart. The old man shone his light on the grate above his head. In newer steam locomotives, it could be opened downward like the ashpan, but this one was fixed in place. So no other way, it had to be cleaned by hand. He wedged a chisel between the steel bars and, tapping with a hammer, began chipping away at the baked-on clinker. He wiped the sweat from his brow. The work was far too strenuous for his strength. He'd have to do it in small batches. He should be able to finish it in 4, maybe 5 days. He also needed to check the steam dome, he reminded himself. The bolt nut was stuck completely, so Igor took a cold chisel and hammer. Major Petrowski, drawn by the noises, entered the shed. At the sight of the old locomotive, he felt a moment of wild excitement. But he quickly realized that this one couldn't belong to the phantom train. The machine in the shed, though from roughly the same era, was much smaller. Igor, dressed in grey work overalls, was fiddling with something near the regulator. Although the Sekop tried to move silently, the old man heard him. "How can I help you?" Uncle Igor turned around, holding a hefty adjustable spanner in his hand. "What are you doing here?" The major, despite his haughtiness, suddenly felt strangely small and vulnerable. Maybe it was the old man's height, or perhaps the fact that Igor, standing on the walkway around the boiler, was placed a good meter above him. Besides, the formidable chunk of steel in the former engineer's hand was also a persuasive argument. He must have been a strong man back in the day, Petrowski thought, and even now, he's no weakling. "I'm repairing the locomotive," the old man answered with dignity and, turning his back, resumed loosening another bolt inside the boiler. "Oh." The Sekop wanted to question him, but to his surprise, he found himself already standing by the shed's door. Looking at the old man's broad back, he realized that the conversation had ended before it even began. He wanted to say something, but all the necessary words seemed strangely tangled in his memory. Damn it! He spat on the tracks and left the building. This old geezer had come here to work here just recently anyway, he reassured himself. As he passed the station, he discreetly glanced at Agata, who was hanging laundry. Nice girl, he thought. Young, but already well-built. I'll have to make some move, or I'll go crazy from boredom guarding this stretch of track. It was almost midnight. Major Petrowski was still poring over documents. A report distributed by the county security office about the moods among Warsaw students had captivated him. He was reading through long columns of statistical data, transcripts of conversations, and wiretaps. A terribly reactionary university, and apparently, it was even worse elsewhere. The screws would have to be tightened. He began noting down proposals for specific measures. The phone, that phone, connected not to the railway network but to the general line, rang right next to his ear. A sharp, insistent sound. The Sekop grabbed the receiver with a sudden motion. "Pietrowski," he barked. "This is the first outpost. Operation Track. The train just passed." "Thank you." He dialed another number. "Militia station," muttered someone in a hoarse, sleepy voice. "Operation Track. The target is approaching," Pietrowski barked into the phone. "We're proceeding with interception according to the variant number 1. Gather the men and all the necessary equipment. Be at the designated location in 20 minutes. Yes, comrade." The second outpost called in. Pietrowski acknowledged the report and glanced at his watch. The ghost train was moving at an impressive velocity, reaching around 80 kilometers per hour. The major ran out of the station building. He removed the cover from his motorcycle, checked to make sure his pistol was in its holster, then started the engine and sped down the path along the tracks. He reached the unguarded crossing almost at the same time as reinforcements arrived. 2 trucks loaded with the necessities, 5 militia officers. "It should be enough. Today we'll catch those bastards," Pietrowski muttered. "Ready for action?" "Yes, Comrade Major," all 5 men shouted in unison. In the distance, the wind carried the rhythmic clatter of wheels. The lights of the locomotive weren't visible yet. The truck loaded with 3 tons of stone stopped on the crossing. The second truck was parked next to it. 2 officers were finishing tightening the screws on the rail blocks. The major personally lowered the semaphore arm, then grabbed a lantern and walked toward the oncoming train. The roar grew louder, turning into a grim rumble. The train was making a terrible racket, and suddenly the agent saw it. The pre-war locomotive, adorned with additional lights, with a huge portrait of Pilsudski at the front. It was lit up like a Christmas tree, no, like a New Year's tree, he corrected himself. He slid in the red lens, changing the color of the lantern. He waved it, signaling stop. The train didn't slow down, didn't even reduce speed, it was charging straight at him. Pietrowski waved again. No effect. The locomotive loomed larger and larger. "They don't see me," flashed through his mind. Or maybe they do, but they don't care. A fraction of a second later, he had only one option left. He dropped flat, pressing himself against the railway ties. The glass of the lantern shattered, the locomotive's draft blew out the acetylene flame, and the train roared over the prone officer. "It's going to hit the barrier, derail, crush me," Pietrowski thought. With immense effort, he forced himself to stay down. He fought the rising panic. His body trembled, his muscles tightened. His mind, gripped by primal fear, urged him to jump up and run as fast as possible. But how could he get up with the greased axles of the wagons flying just above his head? And suddenly he realized he couldn't hear anything. The wagons were rolling over him, the gust of wind tore off his cap, yanked at his coat. The wheels clanged rhythmically on both sides, the ties vibrated, but it all happened in eerie, unreal silence. Then, suddenly, his ears were pierced by a deafening roar. The train passed him and sped away. Pietrowski rolled onto his back. Had he lost consciousness? It seemed so. He couldn't gather his thoughts. Shock from adrenaline? Probably. Above him was a starry sky. The shattered lantern lay next to the tracks. The faint smell of carbide lingered in the air. He got up cautiously and looked around. It was empty, silent, only the wind rustling through the weeds. The train had left, but still. With difficulty, he sat up, then shakily stood. His knees wouldn't straighten, his muscles were weak and trembling, like after a long run. Staggering like a drunk, Pietrowski shuffled toward the crossing. The moon had just come out from behind the clouds, casting light on the terrible scene. Both barriers, torn off by the impact, lay scattered by the tracks. One of the trucks, crushed by the locomotive, had split in two. The other lay flipped upside down a few meters away. The tracks were littered with stones. The horribly mangled bodies of the ambush participants completed the scene of destruction. Only one man had survived, and he wasn't even too badly hurt. Holding his face, he tried to stop the blood dripping from a gash on his brow. The major, though dazed, was the first to regain the ability to think logically. "Stop them!" He pointed at the lanterns of the station workers flashing somewhere along the path. "That's an order?" On it, the militia officer mumbled. He struggled to his feet and limped toward the railway workers. The major, using the radio on his motorcycle, began calling the county security office in Kielce. They were sitting, 3 of them, in the signal box. Igor had gone to sleep, and the Sekop had just left on his motorcycle. Agata put on some water for tea, and an old, greasy deck of pre-war cards lay on the oilcloth-covered table. "You really should learn how to play bridge," Marek gently scolded his daughter. "If Igor knows how to play, we could." "But I can't stay up all night playing with you," the girl smiled. "High school is no joke. I have to study a lot, and I wake up before 6 to make it to class." Yes," he said, frowning. The flagman glanced out the window. Dark rain clouds were rolling across the sky. It had cooled down, it was autumn already. A nasty night. But it felt good to sit in the warmth and listen to the wind howling in the chimney on such a night. He was about to return to the table when, far off, almost on the horizon, the lights of a train flashed. "Damn!" He jumped up and ran to lower the barrier. The station master peered into the darkness, but saw nothing. The night silence was pierced by the distant whistle of a steam locomotive. Did it go into a valley or something, he wondered. He opened the window slightly. Something was approaching, there was no doubt about that. The clatter of the approaching train's wheels carried from afar, but it was still not visible. And then, suddenly, a strange, unnatural silence fell. Even the wind stopped blowing. "It's that," Marek whispered, struck by a terrible realization. "It's coming back. Agata, get to your room and under the covers. Don't look at it." Too late. The ghost train materialized out of nowhere right before them. This doesn't exist. This can't be real, Marek thought. Ghosts don't just appear like this, on command. An unreal, spectral light flooded the room. The locomotive, glowing like a torch, rushed past them in absolute silence. Some debris, stirred up by the train's speed, lazily floated in the air above the tracks. The phantom light illuminated every detail from the darkness. The station master watched in growing astonishment. The image was sharp, terrifyingly sharp. Despite the distance, he could see every rivet, every bolt, every blade of grass on the roadside, and the shadow it cast on the neighboring one. He could see the cracked window pane in the cab, the spots of dirt, and the cloudiness on the surface of the glass. He could also see the silhouette of the engineer. "It's moving very fast, but we see it as if in slow motion," the railwayman thought. He glanced at his watch. The second hand was barely moving. Time had slowed. A thin trail of smoke drifted from the locomotive's chimney. "This is impossible," a completely irrational thought crossed the station master's mind. "They don't have enough steam in the boiler to be going this fast." He closed his eyes, but the horrifying sight didn't disappear. It was still there, imprinted on his eyelids. He opened them again, and nothing had changed. He was forced to watch the scene unfolding before him. The windows of the wagons were darkened, but shadows moved behind the glass. A flatbed with an empty coffin. He didn't know why, but that sight filled him with utter terror. And suddenly their ears were assaulted by a deafening noise. The train had passed the station, time sped up, sounds returned, but the train itself was no longer visible. "We're alive," the girl whispered. She was as pale as a sheet and had to hold onto the edge of the table to keep from collapsing to the floor. Someone knocked on the door. Uncle Igor. Right after him, the flagman rushed inside. "Did you see that?" the old man asked. Though his face was inscrutable, fear lurked in his eyes. Marek was surprised. He hadn't thought this man was capable of being afraid of anything. "Yes," he replied. What? At that moment, a terrifying, blood-curdling crash reached their ears from the direction of the unguarded crossing. The old engineer had heard something like it twice in his life. Marek had been luckier, only once. That ghastly crash and crunch meant that a rapid locomotive had unexpectedly collided with some obstacle. Agata, to the phone! The station master was the first to snap out of it. Call Radom and Kiels, have them send rescue trains immediately. Lower the barriers at the crossing and stay in the signal box. You'll manage the traffic as I showed you. Men, follow me. They hurried down the path toward the crossing. Somewhere ahead, a bright spot of fire was visible. Marek was carrying a bag with a first aid kit, and his two companions were armed with pike poles. They were no more than 50 meters from the crash site when a militia officer blocked their way. His face was horribly battered and blooded. His uniform, missing most of its buttons, looked like rags. One arm hung limply, while in the other, he held a pistol. He must have shoved a flashlight into his pocket. No entry, he mumbled. His lips were also split. Several teeth were missing. As he spoke, blood trickled down his chin. Zenek, don't be ridiculous, the flagman scolded him. We're rushing to the accident. The officer stared at them with a dazed look. His eyes were filled with terror, as if he had seen too much. There was no accident, it's just a drill. He tried to sound firm, but it wasn't very convincing. Suddenly, Major Petrowski appeared behind him. He, too, was deathly pale. His torn and stained coat hung on him like a sack. One sleeve was ripped, and the front of his jacket was covered in numerous stains. However, he didn't seem to have suffered any significant psychological damage. Calm down, comrades, he said. Our men will be here soon, and will handle everything. Your help won't be needed. Go to bed, you've had a hard day. I'm the station master. Marek took a step forward. In 3 hours, a train will pass through here. I need to know. He tripped over his own words. The main line is clear, the Sekop said. The train will pass without any trouble. We'll clean up the rest of the mess ourselves. Am I making myself clear? The railwaymen nodded grimly and turned back. I need to cancel the rescue teams immediately. I wonder what really happened there. Marek muttered as they approached the building. Did they try to derail that train? The flagman pondered. Most likely he tried to, and something didn't go as planned. Igor silently filled his pipe. The limousine parked right next to the crash site, its headlights further illuminating the area. It's bad business what happened, the general said. People will definitely talk about this accident. Accident, the major echoed in his thoughts. The key word, which meant he wouldn't have to answer for the deaths of his subordinates. The botched operation would, of course, go on his record, dogging him for years, hindering his career like a log thrown in his path, but it was better than arrest, demotion, and charges of sabotage. The 8th Department investigated the rumors circulating in the town. Citizens are babbling about a ghost train, saying it can't be stopped, and so on. The general poured himself some coffee from a thermos. And what do you think? Have you analyzed the impact? Yes. I think I know what went wrong. The locomotive was moving extremely fast, possibly even over 90 kilometers per hour. The impact was so powerful it could have knocked a tank off the crossing. My mistake, I was certain they would stop when signaled and that the brakes would be enough. You made a mistake that cost the lives of 4 men. That one who survived, a rookie, just a few months on the job, will be sent to a psychiatric hospital for observation. Maybe the doctors will be able to put him back together. The general looked at the hospital stretcher covered with a blood-soaked shroud. The remains of the militia officers had been extracted from the wreckage of the truck or dug out from under piles of gravel. All 4 bodies were horribly mangled. Luckily, they weren't ours. But the civic militia headquarters is furious. You also barely survived. It's a hard reality, but fighting reactionists is like war. We have to accept the losses. And despite the setbacks, we must complete the mission. Just try to be a bit more careful next time with the technical resources and human assets entrusted to you. The general curled his lips into a smile. especially borrowed ones. Yes, Comrade General. The flagman pulled out a bottle of spiritus and a jar of compote. He skillfully mixed the two and poured the concoction into glasses. There are times when you just need to have a drink to calm your nerves. The rescue trains had just left, and the secops were swarming over the tracks. They've been talking about this for a long time, said the station master. That train has been seen here, in Pomerania, and supposedly even, he looked around nervously, on the other side of the border, in the borderlands. Does it always look the same? The flagman asked. Like it did before the war? I don't know, I was young then and lived far away. But from what I've heard, yes. A locomotive with a portrait of the marshal, adorned with black ribbon and extra lamps, a few passenger cars, and finally a flatbed with a glass coffin. That's correct, Igor puffed on his pipe. I saw it, I was working on Warsaw-Vienna then. Only the coffin was covered with black cloth when they were transporting him. And now that coffin is uncovered, but empty. I asked some friends, and no one knows why, the station master said. Maybe the marshal is sitting in the locomotive? I wonder why, instead of resting in peace, he's rattling around at night. Is he trying to give us courage, or is he paying a penance? Penance? For what? His subordinate asked, puzzled. Well, he had some things on his conscience. The station master stared into the sparks falling into the ashtray. The disappearance of General Zagorski, the imprisonment and death of General Rozwadowski. Maybe something else. They say he even robbed trains in his youth. I've heard that when they were going to bury him in Krakow, in Worel, the archbishop or the primate was outraged and didn't want to allow a bandit to be laid to rest in such a place. But somehow they managed it in the end. Igor said nothing. Wrapped in a quilted blanket, he sipped the strong, sweet drink. He recalled that day at the station in Bezdani. The small wooden building looked normal. And yet, seeing that little station, the young fireman felt a twinge of unease. Something was off, something didn't add up. It wasn't until many months later that he understood what had caused his subconscious discomfort. Usually, the sound of an approaching train would draw travelers out of the waiting room. This time, the platform was completely empty. The engineer stopped the train, someone got off. And suddenly, at the far end of the train, near the mail cars, gunshots rang out. The engineer yanked the regulator, but he applied too much steam to the cylinders. The wheel spun, slipping on the track. Igor, shovel in hand, ran toward the coal cart. He knew they would need a lot of coal soon. The cab door was flung open with a jerk. Stop the train, or I'll shoot. The young fireman turned on his heel and swung the shovel. Two shots merged into one. A bullet hit Igor in the thigh, the force of the impact throwing him back onto the coal. The engineer, wounded in the hip, slid down the wall of the cab. The assailant deftly jumped over him and pulled the brake lever. The wheel screeched deafeningly. Unexpectedly, the locomotive shuddered as if it had hit something. A blast rang out from somewhere behind, followed by a second and the clatter of colliding cars. The man with the pistol stood over the railwaymen. His eyes were terrifying, like a wolf's. Someone's boots clattered on the metal steps, and another attacker appeared in the cab. Were there any problems? He cast a dark look at the two wounded men. A bit. They were feisty, especially the guy with the shovel, but a bullet calms anyone down quickly. Should I finish them off? Igor looked into the man's eyes again. The attacker's gaze was hard, merciless, devoid of human emotion. Leave them, they were just doing their job, as we're doing ours, the newcomer growled. There have been enough corpses for today. Yes, sir. The first one immediately complied. He slid his gun into the leather holster at his belt. These two won't bother us anymore. Let's go. A third explosion was accompanied by the loud crash of a safe's doors falling. Both robbers jumped out of the locomotive. Somewhere, a horse neighed. Igor crawled with difficulty to the door and cautiously peeked out. The last car, the mail car, had been blown apart with dynamite. A dozen or so men were throwing bags of banknotes out of the still-smoking wreck. Others were quickly loading them into 2 carriages. The passengers had scattered in panic. Here and there, along the tracks, lay the bodies of guards and bystanders caught in the crossfire. Igor crawled forward and reached for the lever. Unfortunately, it was too high, and he couldn't lift himself off the ground. Besides, it was already too late. Back then, over half a century ago, the situation was clear. A band of robbers had attacked the train. The locomotive crew was questioned, but the court ruled that the engineer and his firemen had done everything they could to fend off the criminals. The judgment of those events grew complicated later. Several years passed. A free Poland emerged. The man with the revolver became a provincial governor, and his less bloodthirsty companion became the head of the reborn state. And the train robbery was elevated to the status of a grand expropriation action. Piotrowski took the briefcase from the courier. He carried it to his room and, after placing it on the table, stared at it in thought for a while. Orders? Unlikely. Finally, with a sigh, he broke the seals. Inside were a dozen pages of typed reports, a few drawings, and 3 photographs. Reports from 3 other ambushes. The general had likely sent them to him to analyze the failures of his comrades. He delved into the first report, dated 6 years ago. The county security office from Starokowice, alerted by the appearance of the mysterious train, hadn't shown much finesse. After a failed attempt to stop the train under the semaphore, the ghost train was fired upon with small arms, and a grenade was thrown at it. The grenade bounced off the side, and its explosion killed 4 out of the 6 ambush participants. The next report, dated 2 years ago. This time, the train appeared on the Otwock line, heading toward Warsaw. An attempt was made to stop it by switching the tracks to a dead-end spur. However, the train approached with such speed that the switch automatically reset to its original position. The third report described a trap set on the outskirts of Poznan. This time, a 20-meter section of track was partially dismantled. 2 anti-tank rifles were prepared. But although the train had been spotted just a few minutes earlier from a nearby station outpost, it never showed up. "Damn reactionists are playing cat and mouse with us," muttered the major. "Railroad scum. We should fire everyone who started working before the war, and the problems would end." He bit his tongue. The railways employed about 150,000 people. 2/3 had begun their service during the Senation. It would take years to train such a workforce. It wasn't possible to just get rid of them. And where would you find that many jobs for them? How would you pay their salaries? He looked angrily at the wooden wall of the room. A train isn't a needle. It has to take on water at stations, replenish coal supplies, and refill gas or carbide for lanterns. It has to recharge batteries. It has to hide somewhere during the day. He pulled a typewriter from his suitcase, inserted a sheet of paper, and began typing. Outline of the report. First part, assumptions. Point 1, fuel supplies. A locomotive of this size requires several tons of coal each time it's fueled. It also needs oil. He paused. How much is several tons of coal? A cubic meter? 2? 5? Damn it, every day in this country, hundreds of tons of coal are shoveled into locomotive boilers. If railway workers set aside a few hundred kilos each week, no one would even notice. The same goes for the oil. By systematically stealing small amounts, reactionaries could amass quite a lot. Point 2. Periodic maintenance. He pondered. A locomotive has its mileage limits. Every few months, it undergoes an inspection, and every few years, a general overhaul. If used and maintained correctly, it can function for decades. There's no shortage of steam locomotives on Polish tracks that began service during the partition era. There are dozens of repair stations. Every day, a few locomotives go in for inspections, minor and major repairs, or overhauls. Among them, there are certainly locomotives of the same type as the one observed in that fateful train. Point 3. Spare parts. Again, he got lost in thought. It's probably quite difficult to break down a steam locomotive. The grate is made of steel bars, and the firebox is similar. Sometimes a linkage might break, or a fire tube might crack. Something might go wrong with the steam dome, pistons, cylinders, or regulator. Most of these faults are typical for a given locomotive model. They could have stockpiled spare parts by reporting non-existent damages and now use them freely. Point 4. Hiding place. The railway network is a gigantic labyrinth of tracks spanning thousands of kilometers. Besides the main lines, there are reserve tracks, sidings, dead-end tracks leading to factories or mines, for example. Some facilities weren't rebuilt after the war, but tracks still lead to them, cutting through groves and ravines. On top of that, there are dozens of locomotive sheds, warehouses, and repair shops. If someone knows some of these places, they could hide not 1, but 20 trains. He stopped typing and looked at the lines of text on the page. Then, with renewed passion, he began typing again. If we add these elements together, there can be only one conclusion. There is an extensive conspiracy involving railway workers from various parts of the country. The conspirators have at least one train adorned with emblems. He paused. How could an entire train be stolen and removed from the records? A locomotive is not a needle. Writing it off as scrap requires reporting it to the appropriate authorities. Then a transport locomotive tows it to a foundry for melting down. This stage also requires documentation, unless... He recalled the locomotive standing in the shed near the water station. Yes, that's the solution. Since the war, a locomotive has been rusting somewhere, immobilized by a breakdown. The conspiratorial railway workers gradually repaired it, got it running, and now have an unregistered, illegal steam locomotive that they can use, with some caution, to roam the country and fuel their legend. The wagons are a smaller problem, as every day a few are scrapped or undergo a major rebuild. There are so many of them that stealing a few, especially if they disappear at several-month intervals, would not be a big problem. Petrowski rubbed his hands with glee. Suddenly, he froze. Wait, what if it's not just one train? Maybe they didn't even need to play tricks with the records. After all, any train could be slightly disguised. He reread the reports. No. There are only a few locomotives of this type left. It's probably just one. He knew the method used to create the ghost train. He knew how it was supplied with fuel. He suspected how it was hidden. The remaining question was, where was it now? He closed his eyes, lit a cigarette, and took a deep drag. 2 days ago, the locomotive had struck the truck standing in the ambush. Both vehicles were completely destroyed. But could it be assumed that the steam locomotive came out of that collision unscathed? He tore up the unfinished report, locked the materials in the briefcase, sealed it, and stepped outside the building. The courier was waiting, reading a newspaper. Take this to the general, he instructed, and have those materials sent to me from the archive. As soon as possible. He handed over a sealed envelope with the order. Yes, sir. The courier jumped on his bike, kickstarted it, and sped down the road. A timid knock on the door sounded like the gentle patter of raindrops hitting stones. Come in, the old man said, putting down the newspaper. Uncle. Yes? He lifted a questioning gaze to the station master. All his life, everyone had called him Duncle. It was nice to hear that nickname from his superior. We have an unusual task here. We need to clean the boiler in the locomotive. It's not really within your duties, so I'll count it as overtime. No problem. Please have the locomotive brought into the shed, and I'll be there shortly. The engineer was young, maybe 25. The boy knew his stuff. The fireman had already extinguished the firebox earlier. The remaining pressure in the boiler was only sufficient to make minor adjustments to the machine's position. Uncle connected the top valve to the steam release. From below, he attached another hose. He waited until the steam was released, then opened the clean-out covers. He shone a light inside. Fortunately, there wasn't much scale, but there was a thick layer of sludge, probably 30 centimeters deep, at the bottom. Igor pulled over the pressure hose and directed a strong stream of water onto it. The sludge quickly drained into the sedimentation tank. Now the three of them got to work. Using steel scrapers on long poles, they roughly cleaned the inside of the tank from the scale in about 3 hours. 2 more flushes. They tightened all the valves, and the old man filled the boiler with water. The fireman began shoveling coal into the firebox. Igor, observing his work, calmly puffed on his pipe. In about half an hour, the locomotive would be ready to depart. He thought of his little locomotive standing at the end of the shed. Could it be started, or not? If only he could check if the system was operational. And if... Could you give me some starting steam? He asked the engineer. The young man gave the old man a surprised look. Then a flash of understanding lit up his eyes. For that old wreck, he guessed, and Igor felt a pang of disappointment. Sure. Do you have the connecting pipes? I do. I'll just fill its boiler. He pulled the hose over and opened the hydrant. The water hissed through the pipes and crashed into the tank with a roar. 10 minutes later, Uncle decided it was enough. The cleaned locomotive was also almost ready to go. The crew was clearly in a hurry. They were doing him a favor, so it wouldn't be wise to stretch it out. Igor gave the signal. The railwayman climbed into the cab of his locomotive and slowly moved forward. The locomotives nearly touched buffers. Igor quickly lowered the pipe hanging from the ceiling, attached it, and tightened the collars. Then, like a young man, he ran to the cab of his locomotive and stared at the pressure gauge with eager eyes. He was afraid the mechanism had completely rusted, but the needle moved and began its slow journey across the scale. The superheated technical steam introduced into the boiler brought the water to a boil in less than 20 minutes. Uncle dismantled the setup, pulled the pipes back up to the ceiling so they wouldn't be in the way. Thank you very much. He bowed to the engineer. No problem. The young man grinned, showing crooked teeth. Good luck. And to you, too. Safe travels, smooth tracks. The young engineer shifted the valve to change the steam flow direction and drove out of the now heavily smoke-filled shed. Igor climbed the steps into the cab. The pressure gauge needle had already dropped slightly. He needed to hurry. He checked the water gauge. He yanked the throttle lever. Steam from the boiler surged forward. He pulled the sand spreader lever, scattering a thin layer on the rails to increase traction and make starting easier. He felt the familiar vibration of the machine. He placed his hand on the regulator lever and pulled, opening the cylinder valves. The locomotive puffed, a column of steam shot out of the chimney. The pistons moved, the crosshead retracted, the connecting rods creaked, and the wheels completed their first full rotation in many years. Not bad, he assessed the machine's performance. He applied full power, and the locomotive, spitting steam like a boiling kettle, lazily rolled out of the shed. Triumph needed to be announced to the world, so Igor pulled the whistle lever. The low, bass sound drew the station master and his daughter out of the house. The Sekop wasn't in sight. He was probably sitting somewhere, reading these papers of his. Igor smiled triumphantly, then looked at the pressure gauge and froze. The pressure had dropped almost to zero, and the needle was steadily moving toward the end of the scale. He quickly adjusted the regulator and used the last bit of power to reverse the machine back to its resting place. As he backed up, he realized what was wrong. The tracks, ties, and the clean-out pit were all flooded with water. The boiler must have had a serious leak somewhere. The locomotive puffed one last time and came to a stop. The station master burst into the shed 10 seconds later. Mr. Igor, my sincere congratulations. There's nothing to congratulate yet, Uncle sighed, attaching a hose to drain the remaining water. It's just a test run, not even a full one. You were running on someone else's steam, if I observed correctly? So all that's left is to fire up the boiler and... Not quite. Uncle pointed to the water already soaking into the ballast. I need to fix the leaks in the boiler. The left cylinder also needs adjustment. It has some loose movement. So another week of work? That's what I think. Still, I'm impressed. Major Petrowski straightened his internal security corps uniform. He glanced at himself in the mirror, then took a gold watch from his pocket and toyed with the chain for a moment. He liked to look at the slightly worn crest, a symbol of the feudal era, a souvenir of the disgraceful capitalist past that he had personally helped to eradicate. He closed his eyes. It was his first mass execution. They had shot 40 reactionists in the forest, mostly nobility, arrested at night in Lublin and the surrounding areas. And what luck, when they searched the bodies, the colonel found a beautiful Swiss watch on one of them. And instead of keeping it for himself, he gave it to his subordinate as a memento of that day. The Sekop, his boots creaking, stepped outside the station. The station master's daughter was doing laundry. She had placed a wash basin on a stool and was bending over, delightfully sticking out her backside. The major quietly approached her and then gave her a friendly slap on the buttocks. An ass-like, he didn't have time to find the right words because the girl spun around and slapped him hard across the face. He shook his head, surprised. The daze was slowly fading. Where had she gone? She had run off. She dared to slap him? She had the audacity to raise a hand against an officer of the People's State? He'd teach that brat. He caught a glimpse of Igor's face in the window. Just great, the girl had humiliated him in front of that old codger. Furious, he stormed off to his room. He would make a call to the right people, and they would remember this for a long, long time. The old engineer dropped a teaspoon of Georgian tea into a glass and poured boiling water over it. He sighed heavily. He would have to abandon good manners for 10 minutes. He had to take a risk, and his hands would likely get dirty. He glanced at himself in the mirror, adjusted his uniform, and frowned. He looked decent. He pulled a small box from his suitcase. Well, time to get to work. He took a deep breath, twisted his face into a grimace he had seen years ago on the faces of investigators at Lubyanka, and walked into Petrowski's room without knocking, where the Sekop roared at the sight of him and suddenly fell silent, not believing his eyes. On the broad chest of the former engineer gleamed 2 medals, gold and enamel. Until now, the major had only seen such medals in newspapers. The gold star of the Order of Lenin, and next to it another, gold and red, the hero of the Soviet Union. Attention, you son of a bitch, the old man didn't even raise his voice. The major obeyed the command instantly. He snapped to attention like a spring. He clicked his heels. Major of Internal Security Operations Paul Petrowski reporting. Shut the fuck up, you dick. Yes, comrade. The old man walked up calmly, took a swing, and slapped the Sekop across the face. It was a solid hit. The major, spraying droplets of saliva and blood from his split lips, flew backward, hitting his head on the window frame, adding another bump. The girl's slap, though delivered in desperation, had been weak, but now there would be a proper bruise. Igor waited for the major to get up and then hit him a second time, for symmetry. What do you think you're doing? He growled. Your behavior is disturbing the peace of the house where I live, but I? You'll leave the girl alone, once and for all. If I hear that you even looked at her the wrong way, I'll call your Soviet superiors. You'll be feeding white bears with your own liver. Not right away, of course, only after about 15 years of dying slowly in the nickel mines of Norilsk. They ordered you to inspect the line, so inspect it, and after work, get out into the field and look for feed reserves. Yes, comrade. Igor spat at his feet and left. He smiled under his light mustache. How simple everything had become after the war. Just pin on 2 flashy trinkets made by a friendly engraver, shout a bit, give someone a slap, and you can immediately restore these sacks of shit to their class consciousness, or whatever they call it these days. The old engineer dropped a teaspoon of Georgian tea into a glass and poured boiling water over it. He sighed heavily. He would have to abandon good manners for 10 minutes. He had to take a risk, and his hands would likely get dirty. He glanced at himself in the mirror, adjusted his uniform, and frowned. He looked decent. He pulled a small box from his suitcase. Well, time to get to work. He took a deep breath, twisted his face into a grimace he had seen years ago on the faces of investigators at Lubyanka, and walked into Petrowski's room without knocking, where the Sekop roared at the sight of him and suddenly fell silent, not believing his eyes. On the broad chest of the former engineer gleamed 2 medals, gold and enamel. Until now, the Major had only seen such medals in newspapers. The Gold Star of the Order of Lenin, and next to it another, gold and red, the hero of the Soviet Union. "Attention, you son of a bitch," the old man didn't even raise his voice. The Major obeyed the command instantly. He snapped to attention like a spring. He clicked his heels. Major of Internal Security Operations Paul Petrowski reporting. "Shut the fuck up, you dick." "Yes, comrade." The old man walked up calmly, took a swing, and slapped the Sekop across the face. It was a solid hit. The Major, spraying droplets of saliva and blood from his split lips, flew backward, hitting his head on the window frame, adding another bump. The girl's slap, though delivered in desperation, had been weak, but now there would be a proper bruise. Igor waited for the Major to get up and then hit him a second time, for symmetry. "What do you think you're doing?" he growled. "Your behavior is disturbing the peace of the house where I live, but I? You'll leave the girl alone, once and for all. If I hear that you even looked at her the wrong way, I'll call your Soviet superiors. You'll be feeding white bears with your own liver. Not right away, of course, only after about 15 years of dying slowly in the nickel mines of Norilsk. They ordered you to inspect the line, so inspect it, and after work, get out into the field and look for feed reserves." "Yes, comrade." Igor spat at his feet and left. He smiled under his light mustache. How simple everything had become after the war. Just pin on 2 flashy trinkets made by a friendly engraver, shout a bit, give someone a slap, and you can immediately restore these sacks of shit to their class consciousness, or whatever they call it these days. The old engineer dropped a teaspoon of Georgian tea into a glass and poured boiling water over it. He sighed heavily. He would have to abandon good manners for 10 minutes. He had to take a risk, and his hands would likely get dirty. He glanced at himself in the mirror, adjusted his uniform, and frowned. He looked decent. He pulled a small box from his suitcase. Well, time to get to work. He took a deep breath, twisted his face into a grimace he had seen years ago on the faces of investigators at Lubyanka, and walked into Petrowski's room without knocking, where the Sekop roared at the sight of him and suddenly fell silent, not believing his eyes. On the broad chest of the former engineer gleamed 2 medals, gold and enamel. Until now, the Major had only seen such medals in newspapers. The Gold Star of the Order of Lenin, and next to it another, gold and red, the hero of the Soviet Union. "Attention, you son of a bitch," the old man didn't even raise his voice. The Major obeyed the command instantly. He snapped to attention like a spring. He clicked his heels. Major of Internal Security Operations Paul Petrowski reporting. "Shut the fuck up, you dick." "Yes, comrade." The old man walked up calmly, took a swing, and slapped the Sekop across the face. It was a solid hit. The Major, spraying droplets of saliva and blood from his split lips, flew backward, hitting his head on the window frame, adding another bump. The girl's slap, though delivered in desperation, had been weak, but now there would be a proper bruise. Igor waited for the Major to get up and then hit him a second time, for symmetry. "What do you think you're doing?" he growled. "Your behavior is disturbing the peace of the house where I live, but I? You'll leave the girl alone, once and for all. If I hear that you even looked at her the wrong way, I'll call your Soviet superiors. You'll be feeding white bears with your own liver. Not right away, of course, only after about 15 years of dying slowly in the nickel mines of Norilsk. They ordered you to inspect the line, so inspect it, and after work, get out into the field and look for feed reserves." "Yes, comrade." Igor spat at his feet and left. He smiled under his light mustache. How simple everything had become after the war. Just pin on 2 flashy trinkets made by a friendly engraver, shout a bit, give someone a slap, and you can immediately restore these sacks of shit to their class consciousness, or whatever they call it these days. The Major rode his motorcycle up to the crossing. Near the tracks, someone had driven a small wooden cross into the ground. A votive candle in front of it was still burning. Pietrowski stomped out the flame with his boot, then yanked the cross out of the ground, broke it angrily, and tossed it into the bushes. What a backwardness! The traces of the catastrophe from a few days ago had been cleaned up, but here and there on the roadside, pieces of crushed stone from the smashed truck still lay scattered. Clearly, the cleanup had been sloppy. The location wasn't bad, but for his plan to succeed, it needed to be properly prepared. Next to the tracks lay 2 old wooden railroad ties. Apparently, some repairs had been done here a few years ago, and no one had bothered to remove these damaged ones. And that was just fine. Pietrowski liked it when everything went according to his plan. He pulled a measuring tape and a small shovel from his briefcase. He carefully measured the width and thickness of the beam, then began digging out the ballast from between the rails. After digging down to a depth of about 70 centimeters, he took a bowl, a large paper bag of cement, and 5 bottles of water from the motorcycle's basket. He mixed the mortar and carefully smoothed the walls of the hole. Now he just had to wait for it to set. He sat down in the sidecar, pulling a newspaper from his boot. He immersed himself in reading. Finally, he decided enough time had passed. He lifted the old railroad tie and carefully lowered one end into the prepared hole. A perfect fit, he assessed his work. A 2-meter pole now stood between the tracks, pointing up to the sky. During the operation, it would only need to be further secured with a few stones. Pietrowski removed the beam and placed it back where it had been before. He packed the rest of his tools onto the motorcycle and, satisfied with himself, sped off toward the water station. Uncle Igor sat on the steps in front of the shop, slowly sipping water from a glass. His throat was dry, and the local lemonade, which tasted like soggy hard candy, only made his thirst worse. He had finished his shopping, and it was time to head back to his quarters. "Isn't it hard for you to walk all the way from the station?" the shopkeeper asked. "That's about 4 kilometers one way." "At your age, what can one do?" He shrugged. "Once every few days, I need to buy a newspaper. And it's been a while since I've been around people. It's nice to hear some gossip." He hit the shopkeeper's weak spot. She loved to gossip, but the locals, unfortunately, didn't want to talk much with her. The times weren't exactly conducive to repeating overheard news either. "I've got my father's old bicycle for sale," she said. "Maybe it would suit you." Igor thought for a moment. "It's been sitting in the attic since the war," she added. "We don't have time for such activities anymore. Can I take a look?" "Come around to the back." She rolled the bicycle out of the shed. Igor looked at it with interest. A nice handlebar with Bakelite grips, a leather saddle, darkened with age but still in good condition. The mechanism looked terribly dirty, but at first glance, Igor could tell it was just a thick layer of dust clinging to the grease. He examined the wheels. Good rims, a composite glued from several layers of different types of wood. A pre-war Luchnik from the arms factory in Radom, he identified. The civilian version. The ones made for the military had metal wheels. But after all these years, neither the inner tubes nor the tires work anymore. They'd need to be replaced, and where can you find such things now? My son managed to get new ones. Well, almost new, she corrected herself. Foreign, Dunlop. And the inner tubes are domestic. How much are you asking? He knew he should play it cool, pretending he wasn't really interested, and they should haggle for the next 15 minutes, but he neither had the strength nor the time for that. The woman named a price that would make someone more sensitive faint. He just smiled. "Dear lady, let's talk seriously." He pulled a gold 10-ruble imperial coin from his pocket. The woman's eye sparkled at the sight of the gold. "You'll throw in spare inner tubes and a pump, and I could use a small wicker basket to attach to the luggage rack." The shopkeeper was silent for a moment. Finally, she nodded, sealing the deal. Gold was a good investment. It comes and goes. Her son would be getting married soon, and the piggy could be melted down into 2 wedding rings. The gold would be just enough. And if he didn't get married, she could go to the dentist, get 2 gold teeth, and the rest of the coin would cover the fee for that greedy tooth puller. It was worth it, especially since she got it for an old and worn-out bicycle that was just taking up space in the attic. Igor asked for a cloth and a bit of oil. In half an hour, he had cleaned the mechanism, then changed the tires and pumped up the wheels. By the time he finished, it was dark. "It's a shame I don't have a lamp for the bicycle," the shopkeeper fretted. "How will you manage in the dark?" "My dear lady, I've dealt with much bigger problems in my life." The major took a sip of vodka. He glanced at his gold watch. It was nearing 11 at night. He stretched lazily and pushed aside the script. Time to go to bed. Everything was thought out, planned, ready. Now, all he needed was patience. As long as he didn't have any more nightmares. At that moment, the phone rang. Piotrowski grabbed the receiver. "Piotrowski speaking," he barked. "Comrade, this is the first post reporting. They just passed us. Moving very fast." "Thank you." He put down the receiver, then picked it up again. He dialed a secure number. "Operation Attract," he barked into the microphone. "Red alert." "Yes, ready." He slammed the script shut, tossed it into his briefcase, sealed it, and prepared a bottle and a cotton wad. He looked out the window. The station master and the flagman were sitting in the booth, apparently playing cards again. The old guy from the pump hadn't returned yet. Good. The phone rang a second time. Piotrowski didn't answer, he just looked at his watch. Suddenly, his throat went dry. The ghost train had passed the second observer in less than 5 minutes. This could only mean one thing: it was moving really fast, at least 130 kilometers per hour, meaning it would be at the ambush point in no more than 20 minutes. Running down the corridor, he drenched the wad with chloroform. A faint light seeped from under Agata's room door. He kicked it open. The girl, who was sitting at the table, jumped up, frightened. In one leap, he was on her, pressing the wad to her nose. Agata struggled a few times in his grip, then went limp. The chloroform did its job. The major snapped handcuffs onto her wrists. Under the thin nightshirt, her breasts looked very appealing. He gritted his teeth. Perhaps he could. No time. After the operation, if it succeeded, there wouldn't be time for distractions either. And if it failed, there wouldn't be much left of her. Well, she's not the only one in the world. He carried the limp body out to the porch, threw it into the motorcycle sidecar. He jumped onto the seat and started the engine. In 10 minutes, the reactionist train could already be here. Uncle Igor was riding slowly. He felt tired, having fallen out of practice with the bicycle. The light bulb above the door of the water station building shone brightly. That sight guided him like a star in the darkness of the autumn evening. Just a little further, and in a few minutes, he would have a strong cup of tea. The door slammed, and the Sekop burst out of the building, carrying something over his shoulder, and dashed towards his motorcycle. What the devil? The old man was so shocked he nearly let go of the handlebars. The major threw what appeared to be a dead or unconscious Agata into the sidecar and, jumping onto the saddle, sped off. Igor reached under the frame. He unhooked the pump, a solid, 60-centimeter piece of thick-walled steel tube. "I should have killed that trash right away. But they say there's luck in leisure," he whispered. The motorbike was about to pass him. Igor decided he would strike the Sekop on the head with the pump. At that speed, even if he had a helmet, he'd be dead on the spot. The girl might get hurt, but it was his only chance. Unfortunately, instead of taking the road, the motorcycle sped down the path along the tracks. Uncle Igor muttered a Russian curse under his breath and set off in pursuit. He pedaled the bicycle with all his might, but he knew he couldn't catch the bastard. Unless the major planned to rape the girl right there, near the station. Then there was a chance, 1 in 1,000, that he could prevent it. And suddenly, just as he was about to lose hope, he spotted a bright point. The motorcycle. The Sekop had parked it near the crossing. From somewhere far away, the wind carried the dull rumble of a train. Igor strained his eyes. Dear God, he whispered, seeing the sleeper sticking up vertically from the tracks. Has he gone mad? Agatha was hanging from the post, her toes barely touching the ground. The chain of the handcuffs that bound her wrists had been hooked onto the remains of a clamp that originally held the rail. Her head hung limply, she was clearly unconscious. Igor raced as fast as he could, the sound of the train's wheels growing louder. And suddenly, the space around him was flooded with silvery light. Silence fell. He glanced to the side. The ghost train, the same one he had seen the previous night, was passing him by. The old engineer let go of the handlebars with one hand and made the sign of the cross. The apparition didn't disappear. In the eerie silence, the carriages flew by, the first, the second, the fifth, the platform, and the empty glass coffin on the gun carriage. And suddenly, he realized he was going faster than the train. The train was braking silently, sparks flying from under the wheels. The old man overtook the platform and was now racing alongside the carriages. The locomotive was also braking, the train slowing down. Maybe there was still a sliver of hope to save his acquaintance's daughter. The front wheel jumped over a piece of ballast, and the old man's bicycle flew sideways. Igor tumbled onto the grass, hitting his elbow, but after a moment, unsteadily on his feet, he continued running. Petrowski, his eyes wide with excitement, watched as the locomotive braked. Long trails of sparks shot out from under the wheels, and the train silently came to a halt no more than 2 meters from the girl hanging on the pole. The major looked around, but the backup of course hadn't managed to arrive on time. He had to fight on his own. He dashed forward. He jumped over the ditch that collected water from the tracks and reached the locomotive. Here, he hesitated for the first time. The metal glowed with a dull, unreal light. They covered the train with phosphorescent, he guessed quickly, but just in case, he struck it with his hand. Under his fingers, he felt ordinary rough metal. Not a ghost train, he calmed himself. No ghosts. This is material. He yanked the pistol from his holster. His hobnailed boots clattered on the metal steps. He yanked open the cab door. With his weapon ready to fire, he burst inside. Security office, he roared. Don't yell, rat! The man who looked like Joseph Pilsudski eyed Petrowski with disdain. Since you're here, don't interfere, just help, we're about to move on. What a job they did making him up, thought the major. Like he walked out of a movie. Up against the wall, he shouted, waving his pistol. Documents. How many of you are on this train? The engineer, ignoring the orders, moved toward him. Petrowski pulled the trigger 3 times. Just like he'd been taught, in the legs, in the torso, in the head. In the next split second, someone wrenched the pistol from his grip, painfully dislocating his fingers. The SecOp looked up and froze. Just a moment ago, there had been no one there, and now he was standing there, the nightmarish prisoner from his dreams. That's impossible, the major whispered. You're still locked up there. This is just a dream. Karstek Banaki smiled ironically. If you're in doubt, pinch yourself, he advised. Petrowski preferred to cross himself. The apparition didn't disappear. The former legionnaire still stood before him, younger by a good 40 years. And only his wolfish eyes hadn't changed, still gleaming with a mix of contempt and fury. Suddenly, the secret policeman noticed that the prisoner had grown impressive horns on his head. He'll be as much help as a trumpet from a goat's ass, the marshal sneered, looking at his bullet-riddled uniform. Take him to the wagons, he'll be more useful there. We're about to move on. He glanced at the tracks ahead of the locomotive and smiled under his mustache. Uncle hadn't just unhooked the girl, he was also dismantling the rest of the obstacle on his own initiative. Agatha lay on the couch in the station master's apartment. Igor, wheezing like a locomotive, collapsed into a chair. The effort nearly killed him, but he had managed to carry the unconscious girl all the way here. He had made it. His heart was pounding like never before, each beat accompanied by a dull pain behind his sternum. Fortunately, the pain was slowly subsiding. The flagman handed him a glass of water. "Dear God," Marek whispered, grasping a hacksaw. What that scoundrel did to her? Fortunately, nothing, Uncle murmured, filling his pipe. And never ask what he planned. She's just dazed from the chloroform. She should wake up soon. There will be trouble. The flagman slipped a piece of metal under the rim of the handcuffs. Start sawing. They'll certainly question us, the old engineer stated, releasing a puff of fragrant smoke. When a security office major disappears without a trace, that's one thing. But if he disappears during an operation and all that's left is his motorcycle, things could get ugly. Did that train run him over, or did you knock him out? Never mind, the station master reconsidered. We need to clean up the body immediately, or at least stage an accident. I'll take care of it. The flagman stood up. His own mother wouldn't recognize him. Or maybe it's better to drag him off somewhere and bury him. If you sprinkle the ground with kerosene, the dogs won't find him. Where's the corpse? There is no body. I doubt it'll ever be found, Igor grumbled. What do you mean by that? That scum realized his dream. He stopped that train. And then he got on board. Remember, we don't know anything. We were sitting together, heard him get a call, he ran out, started his motorcycle, and left. Where to? We don't know. We didn't look. 20 minutes later, the train passed through the station, and that's it. There was no kidnapping, we saw nothing, we heard nothing. He was here, then he left, he's their man, let them find him. What do we, simple folk, know about state secrets? They all nodded solemnly. How can I repay you? Marek asked. Just bring back my bicycle. It's lying in the bushes near the crossing. Better if they don't find it there. Interrogations began at dawn and lasted all day. Security office and the militia ransacked the station's buildings. Officers examined every inch of the tracks. They found nothing. They also didn't have much to latch onto. None of the water stop employees seemed to be involved in the matter of the train or the major's disappearance. The militiamen who were supposed to assist him fared worse. The 4 officers couldn't explain why it took them 40 minutes by truck to cover the 5-kilometer stretch from the precinct to the crossing. Finally, at 8 in the evening, the uninvited guests left, and the station's inhabitants could breathe a sigh of relief. Cursing the pain in his back, Igor shoveled coal. The first layer in the furnace had already caught, but he needed to add more fuel to give the locomotive a chance to move. He glanced at the water gauge, then at the pressure gauge. The needle was creeping across the dial very slowly. They won't get much out of this little engine, he sighed, puffing on his pipe. It's just a piece of junk from 50 years ago. On the other hand, a little use is better than none, especially since the production of new ones doesn't even meet the Allies' needs. He smirked maliciously. He added another load of coal. 20 minutes later, he decided it was enough. He activated the sanders, pulled the throttle lever, and then released the steam into the cylinders. The engine hissed, and just like a few days ago, its wheels began to turn. It started to move, slowly gaining speed. He guided it out of the shed into the darkness of the night, drove it to the end of the tracks, stopped the locomotive for a moment, jumped off, and switched the points. He steered the locomotive onto the main line and added steam. The distance between the water stop and the unlucky crossing was covered in less than 4 minutes. All the mechanisms were functioning, everything was working like clockwork. However, he was hesitant to go any further. If a sudden malfunction occurred, he could block a strategically important line. That would mean a trial for sabotage and an inevitable death sentence. He had soldered as if it were brass and not tin, but his hand was no longer as steady as it once was, and the material was of poorer quality. He braked and shifted the reversing lever. The steam changed direction, and the wheels began to turn backward. He drove the locomotive back to the station. He noticed one of the lanterns had gone out, but it didn't matter much. Shunting, he muttered to himself, recalling what such a signal meant. Ah, damn it! The switch must have been automatic, returning back on its original position. Instead of turning into the shed, he found himself passing the pump, still on the main track. Well, in the end, what's the harm, he asked himself. 2 more passes, 5 minutes of pleasure more. Or 10 minutes. The night train won't be here for at least 2 hours, so who would I disturb? He justified himself. He passed the flagman's hut. The surprised railway workers peered out of the window. He gave them a playful salute and changed direction again. The boiler was just now reaching the right temperature. Igor tightened his grip on the levers. To give full power, to speed into the night at full throttle. Once, long before the war, when he was the engineer of the Lux torpedo train, he set an unbeaten record on the Krakow, the Zakopane route. And what if he tried his strength one more time? Suddenly, terrified, he yanked the brake handle. The wheel spat sparks in all directions, throwing the old man forward, but fortunately, he didn't hurt himself. He left the engine under steam and jumped down the steps. The ghost train stood before him. It seemed that all he had to do was reach out to touch the shining, blue glowing sides. The buffers of the locomotives were no more than 10 centimeters apart. He had avoided a collision at the last moment, stopping. The cab door creaked open. Igor stared in disbelief. The engineer was descending the iron steps. Tall boots, breeches, a uniform jacket, and a face, strangely youthful, more reminiscent of the one he remembered from the Bezdani station than the one on the reverse of pre-war coins. The ghost stopped suddenly, just above the ground. Apparently, the last step was a boundary he couldn't cross. Igor. Marshal Pilsudski spoke. His voice sounded strangely muffled, as if coming from far away. Move your locomotive back about 10 meters, then switch the points for us. It's high time to change direction. It's a dead end, leading to the broad gauge. Your wheels won't fit. You won't be able to go that way. The ghost smiled under his mustache. It was a terrifying smile. Igor's throat went dry. In an instant, he understood that arguing was pointless. Don't you spin your head around this. We'll manage. Yes, sir. He climbed back into his cab and reversed the engine, making room. He stopped, jumped down, and switched the points. The mechanism, despite never being used, was well greased and had withstood the test of time. It only needed a little loosening up. With one hand, he saluted, and with the other, he pulled the lever. The chief turned and climbed the steps back into the cab. "Can I go with you?" the old man suddenly asked. He didn't even know why these words had escaped his lips. After all, he wasn't in a hurry to cross over to the other side just yet. "You haven't done anything evil enough to board my train," the voice, barely louder than a whisper, reached him. "Keep waiting, another train will come for you someday." The locomotive hissed, and the cars rolled along the rusty track to the east. The old engineer stared in awe. Until now, he had thought they were just ordinary passenger coaches, 4-axle Pullmans. Only now did he notice that each one had countless wheels. All were driven by crankshafts disappearing under the frame. Through the dark windows, he saw dozens of hunched figures. The ghost train, like an ancient galley, was driven by human muscle power. Who were the marshal's prisoners? He could only guess. The last car passed the switch, and the train disappeared, as if it had dissolved into the air. Only the distant sound of wheels clattering on the track joints remained. And suddenly, Igor's ear caught a sharp ringing, as if someone had struck a small bell. He instinctively moved toward the sound. The moonlight illuminated a field of weeds overgrowing the disused line. In its light, the gold watch lying on a stone was clearly visible. The old man picked it up and shone his flashlight on it. A large gold onion, which he had seen in the major's hands just yesterday. He lifted the find to his ear. Tick, tick, tick. A solid Swiss-made piece. The watch had survived the fall. Uncle pressed his thumb, and the case popped open. Inside was a small, folded note. He unfolded it. The writing was barely legible, the message scrawled in haste and in a shaking wagon. He said, "We're going to Moscow. Warn Comrade Stalin." Trembling with suppressed joy, he tore the paper into pieces and let the wind carry them into the darkness. Finally, he muttered under his breath. He staggered toward the waiting, steaming locomotive. It had to be brought into the service shed, and then he could get some sleep. Tomorrow he'd work on it some more, and maybe he could manage to adjust the compressor. And then? He'd ask for half a day off, take the engine to Radom. The bonus would come in handy. He needed to buy a lot of newspapers. The coming days would be filled with extraordinary and joyful events.